This is essentially a way to defend people and protect them from imminent genocide. There should be provisional Amhara administration in these areas, especially in eastern and Wolega, where there are significant Amharas residing. And the reason for this is because the regional government, federal government, have failed to protect citizens, and they have failed to govern, and they have failed to fulfill their responsibilities as a government. The OLA spokesperson admitted that they were conducting joint operations with the Oromia Special Forces. Amhara civilians are being targeted. There is no dependable force to protect them, and their human rights are not being looked after.
So Mr. Robel Alemu is a communication director of AAA, and he is also a PhD student in Canada, Toronto. Today we're going to discuss on several issues, especially on the reports that AAA is releasing continuously, especially on the issue of Amharas in Wolega and different Amhara regions, Oromia regional states, and also the issue of Addis Ababa. Mr. Robel, thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me, Maza.
Thank you. So let me start from the report. Your several reports as a AAA. As I mentioned before, you are the communication director of AAA. So as long as you're the communication director, I want you to summarize the investigation that you have been releasing in different times, especially in the issue of Wolega and other areas of Oromia regional states. Would you mind to summarize the reports that you've been releasing about the issue?
Certainly. Thank you, Ma'aza, for asking this important question. Yes, my name is Robel, and I am Director of Communications for AAA, and I'm happy to talk to you today about some of the reporting that AAA has released. As your audience probably is aware, AAA, or Amhara Association of America, is a civic organization based in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the United States. However, AAA has a team of human rights investigators in Ethiopia that conducts independent investigations into any abuses against Amhara civilians and at times other civilians throughout the country. And so the situation in the Oromia region of Ethiopia has been particularly concerning, given the overwhelming number of reports from media agencies, from journalists, from different sources about what's been happening to the Amhara people specifically, and general violence, war between different armed groups. And so the violence in Oromia region in recent weeks and months has taken a particularly intensified turn compared to in the past. And AAA has been producing these reports for over 2 years now, more than 2 years. And so, for example, AAA issued an annual report covering human rights violations in 2021. And that annual report covered 133 incidents in which investigators found that at least 929 people were killed, 151 were injured, 107 were arrested, and 61 were abducted. And this was for the year of 2021. However, in the current year of 2022, there's been a drastic increase in these human rights violations, in these identity-based attacks. And traditionally, the perpetrators of these atrocities have been the Oromo Liberation Army, or OLA, or as it's sometimes known, the Oromo Liberation Front, Shenne. And this armed group has in the past been responsible, according to our sources, for these targeted human rights violations. However, we've increasingly found a trend of involvement of direct involvement of regional security forces, namely the Oromia Special Forces. And so, just to give you a sense of what's been happening in recent months, for example, we can go back to June of 2022, when we saw one of the most devastating massacres, the Tole massacre, which occurred on June 18th. And this was in the Gimbi district of Western Wolega in the Oromia region. And this was particularly devastating because we saw one of the largest death tolls of civilians that were targeted for their ethnicity and killed by this suspected OLA militants. And so in this massacre alone, at least 554 Amhara civilians were killed, and was able to identify 455 by name. And the problem was that this actually continued, and then in July we saw the Lemlem massacre in the Alemu zone, and this again claimed another 308 Amhara lives, and then injured 36 people. Now, in the recent months, especially from November to December, there's been an uptick in violence in the eastern Wodlaga and Horo-Gudru Wodlaga zones. And in these areas, AAA actually released a report recently covering the period between November 18th and December 8th. And so in the span of a few weeks, our investigators were able to confirm that at least 219 Amharas were killed, 107 Amharas were injured, and 40 went missing. 62 were arbitrarily detained, and more than 25,000 residents were displaced. So this report was different from the others because it covered, or it implicated the Oromia Special Forces and also the local collaborators, including the Kero. So this recent uptick in violence, what set it apart from the previous ones was the involvement of the Oromia Special Forces. And this was particularly concerning because these are state forces, so not just a rebel group perpetrating these atrocities. And so these militants were equipped with advanced weaponry, and there was clear complicity from the regional government. So there was complicity from government officials. And this is just a sample of some of the atrocities. There was another report we issued covering human rights violations in the Dera district in northern Showa. And between January and November of 2022, at least 73 Amharas were found to be killed, and 71 victims were identified by name. And overall, we can see that already, based on a select few incidents, that the death toll in 2022 has already eclipsed the one in 2021. And so I have not mentioned many of the other incidents, especially Eastern Showa, Western Showa, and other parts of the Oromia region. But if all of these were combined, we'd be looking at a very high death toll, and AAA is working to issue the annual report of human rights violations against Amhara civilians for the year of 2022. So this will be released in the coming few months, and this will highlight a more in-depth summary. But this is just to highlight the trend that there's these identity-based attacks traditionally perpetrated by the OLA, but more recently with involvement from the Oromia Special Forces, Kero, local government officials, and this is an ongoing issue that we're seeing transpire on a daily basis.
Thank you, Robel. This is a very detailed summary. But in your speech, you were mentioning the Oromia Special Force, and also in most of your reports as a AAA, you've been accusing the state apparatus in involving these issues. So do you have an evidence in order to come with this conclusion? Many people asking that because people say the Oromia Special Force do this, the state has some kind of involvement in this like this. But does AAA have concrete evidence on this?
Thank you, Ma'aza. This is an important question. And I think when we talk about state complicity, that takes different forms. And throughout our reporting, we've seen very detailed documentation of how this has happened in different forms. In the past, this complicity was seen in different forms, for example, in security forces failing to protect citizens. And so the failure of security forces to protect citizens in itself is a failure of the regional government and the federal government. So that's the simplest form of complicity. But even going past that, there have been documented cases of regional officials directly inciting violence. We have evidence of local Warada level administrative offices on their direct official communication pages, issuing hate speech and inciting violence against Amhara people. And this is a form of direct complicity. And again, as I said before, the involvement of the Oromia Special Forces. And this is based on a lot of witness testimony, survivor testimony. Our investigators have done their due diligence to collect this information from many sources. And the reports are very much in line. So all of these people are telling us the very similar things. There's different rationales that they use to distinguish these different armed groups. For example, the special forces have a distinguished or a distinct uniform. They are equipped with a distinct arsenal of weapons compared to the Owole traditionally. And much of the time, there's different types of vehicles involved and other factors that have led these people to conclude that the special forces are involved. So the involvement of the special forces is something that has been widely reported, and in fact, the Owole itself has admitted to working with the special forces in an interview with a certain Western media outlet. The Owole spokesperson admitted that they were conducting joint operations with the Oromia Special Forces. And so this is a clear sign of complicity, the involvement of the regional officials. In many cases, in some cases, we found that regional officials were either directly providing information to the Owole militants, or in some cases, they were even related. So in some of the cases, the regional officials were related to Owole militants. And so we see a very diverse amount of evidence that concludes that there is a complicity. And this is something that's very concerning because these Amhara civilians are being targeted. There is no dependable force to protect them, and their human rights are not being looked after. So this is why AAA believes that what's happening is clearly a genocide against Amharas. This has been going on for the last at least 4 years in its current form, and this is something that's ongoing. And so this is something that preceded, for example, the war in the north, and it's intensified, and it seems to be getting worse with time. And on a daily basis, we are getting reports of new human rights violations.
Thank you. One thing that, though you're saying this, the government is labeling the people, the Amhara people in Wolega as extremist Amharas or the Amhara farmers. And again, previously in one of the Prime Minister's speech in Sodo town, the Prime Minister said they're Amhara Shene and Oromo Shene. So they are trying to make it a conflict between those extremists from Oromo and extremists from Amhara, where there is a taking place of a kind of conflict between those extremists. But you're saying there is a genocide, there is a serious atrocity which is targeted only the Amhara people, whereas the government is concluding like that. What's your reflection as a AAA on this issue?
Yes, this is a very important issue. Thank you, Maza. So the recent speech by the Prime Minister definitely used this terminology. In fact, he referred to, he used a new term in which he said Amhara Shene. Based on our reporting, there's no group called Amhara Shene. It doesn't exist. But this appeared to be an attempt to draw a false equivalence with the Oromo Liberation Army, the atrocities that have been happening, in an effort to downplay the atrocities that have been happening against Amhara civilians. And so these atrocities have been documented and reported by AAA. This is something that's been reported by various media agencies, by political parties, by human rights organizations. So there is a mountain of evidence that clearly states that there have been a pattern of identity-based attacks against Amhara civilians. That's not to say that human rights abuses are not happening to other groups. However, there is a disproportionate level of attacks against ethnic Amharas in the Oromia region and also in other parts of the country. So these remarks are very insensitive, but we've seen an uptick in these types of inflammatory remarks, not just from the Prime Minister, but also from the regional government, from other government officials, and even from opposition parties and certain media agencies. And so this rhetoric of being used especially during periods of targeted attacks against Amharas, and we believe this is an attempt to frame the victims of genocide as the perpetrators. And so this is an effort to downplay the genocide, to ensure that the victims are not able to tell their stories, and to abdicate responsibility, because if they can deny the crimes, then they deny the including the accountability aspect of this. So this is something we've seen from official communications from even the Oromo Prosperity Party or the Oromo Regional Government. In some cases, there have been irresponsible use of this term from some human rights organizations as well. But we believe that it's becoming clear that this is a deliberate effort to undermine the genocide. And we, according to our documentation, there's a very large body of evidence that clearly indicates very frequent, large-scale identity-based attacks against Amhara civilians. And so, any attempt to downplay that or to conceal that is, we find, very irresponsible and almost an admission of guilt from those respected parties.
Thank you. Can you share us your recent report about the arrest of students and teachers in Addis Ababa, and even your general concern, AAA's general concern about Addis Ababa? As you know, so many students and teachers are under arrest due to the issue of the Oromia flag. And so what's your recent report, and also what is your general concern about the issue?
Thank you, Maaza. This is another very important question. AAA issued a report covering the recent string of mass arrests in Addis Ababa. The report covered the period between December 1st and 15th, although this issue has been happening in the past. And so there's also other related issues that AAA has addressed. But this recent report detailed that at least 209 teachers, students, and individuals were subject to arbitrary detentions in various primary and secondary schools in Addis Ababa city. This was in connection with the recent policy by the regional or the city administration to impose the Oromia region flag and regional anthem in schools, and forcing these students to operate with this new these new flags and anthems. And this forced imposition was met with opposition. So local students, teachers, parents opposed this, and they held peaceful demonstrations. And these peaceful demonstrations were then met with excessive force by security forces. Many students sustained beatings, physical abuse, arrests, and many of these students were actually underage. So these were not adults, but children that were arrested and faced beatings and sustained injuries in many cases. And this is a very concerning issue because Addis Ababa is a very important city. It's the federal city of Ethiopia, but there are efforts that AAA believes there are efforts by the city administration and by the federal government to essentially change the demographics and the identity of Addis and impose another identity. So this is part of what we feel is an effort by the government to use this ethnic apartheid system to impose a system where there is a special benefit for one ethnic group at the expense of others, and to create a system where certain citizens are considered less than others. And when we say this, this is to say that people who have been living in Addis, for example, for generations, since it was first constructed would be made to be labeled as settlers, as not belonging to their homes, and would be forcibly displaced. And so these policies have become in different shapes and forms, but we saw the mayor of Addis, Ms. Adanej Abebe, recently make a press statement or a speech that was very irresponsible and echoed what the Prime Minister had said, trying to blame not just the OLA, but also so-called Amhara extremists and Western powers for this unrest and this opposition to the policies in Addis, but also to the ongoing violence in wolega in the Oromia region. So as AAA, we feel that this is a very concerning issue, because we feel Addis Ababa, while it's home to many different groups, is a city that has very close ties with the Amhara people. We know from from scholars who've studied the history of Addis that it traces its roots back to the medieval capital of Barara, and Barara is the heritage of the Amhara people of Ethiopia. And so any effort to label Amharas as not belonging to their homeland of Addis is something that is not just illegal, but not supported by history, not supported by any type of documentation, but rather is an effort by the extremists in power to impose their will and to forcibly incorporate this city into the Oromo region.
Yeah, thank you. So, given this detailed reporting is in Addis Ababa and in Oromia, does AAA put any kind of recommendation in order to ease this suffering of Amharas? Is there anything that is recommended as a AAA?
Yes. So the issue both in Addis and in wolega. So in wolega, when we talk about Oromia region, there's violence in many parts, but based on the investigations, we can say that a lot of the violence has been concentrated in wolega, and then recently in eastern wolega and Horogudru wolega. So the proposal that AAA has been pushing in recent weeks is that there should be provisional Amhara administration in these areas, especially in eastern and Horogudru wolega, where there are significant Amharas residing. And the reason for this is because the regional government, federal government, have failed to protect citizens, and they have failed to govern, and they have failed to fulfill their responsibilities as a government. And as a result of this, there is an existential threat to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Amhara residents who have been living in these areas peacefully for many years. And because of this existential threat, there is a need to protect these people. And as we can see from other cases, Amhara administration would ensure that the protection of these people is looked after. For example, in the north of the country, following the liberation of areas such as Welkait and Raya, although the history is a little bit different, these residents there enjoyed relative peace, as opposed to when the Tigray People's Liberation Front was administering these areas. And this is essentially a way to defend people and protect them from imminent genocide. These people otherwise would face a very dangerous threat, and the recent involvement of the Oromia Special Forces demonstrates that the state is complicit in the initiative to ethnically cleanse and eliminate Amharas from these areas. So provisional Amhara administration would ensure the protection of these people. And this is something that is extremely practical, because we see that in Amhara region, it is one of the most diverse regions in Ethiopia, and there are self-administration areas for many minorities, including ethnic Oromos in the Oromo Special Zone, located towards the east of the Amhara region. And the residents there have been able to live in relative peace. However, this is not the case for Amharas residing throughout the Oromia region, particularly in the wolega area. So this is a proposal that we've put forward that we believe is very practical and would ensure that these people are able to survive. However, if this is something that's not acceptable, another alternative would be simply to revisit this idea of this ethnic federalism system that designates land masses to a single ethnic group. And if this system were revised and we saw a return to the old geographical provincial system, this could also potentially be a way to mitigate the impact of ethnic-based attacks, identity-based attacks, particularly against Amharas in the wolega area. As for Addis, as I said, Addis Ababa also deserves the ability to administer itself, and currently the administration in Addis, it's being administered by mayors who are not from Addis. These are not people who are from Addis. These are people who have been delegated from other areas, and so they do not, their interests and the interests of the administration are not in line with that of the people. And Addis also, as I said, traces its roots back to the ancient capital of Barara, and as such is a place where Amhara administration would also be not just helpful to mitigating these apartheid policies, but something that would be restoring basically the order. Because when we go back to this pre-ethnic federalism system, Addis was one of the primary cities in the histories of Shoah. Post-ethnic federalism was essentially dismantled. So restoring this way of doing things would promote citizens to live peacefully and without fear of having the will of other political actors imposed onto them. And we are worried also that the current trajectory of policies in Addis are a gateway to future mass atrocities, including cases that we've seen in other parts of the Oromia region. We fear that these could be repeated in Addis, and therefore, preemptively to prevent these mass atrocities from happening and to protect these citizens, we believe that the Addis Ababa should also be restored to Amhara administration. But as I said, if the ethnic federalism system is reconsidered and upended, then this also would be resolved, because it would simply fall back under the historic province of Shoah, which is a geographical construct.
You know what? This is a very detailed issue, but it's very controversial policy that you're recommending as a AAA. This is very controversial recommendation. So, do you think this can be feasible?
Mm-hmm.
It
does. Thank you, Maza. Yes. What we're trying to say as AAA is that these recommendations should not be controversial. There is definitely a desire to frame them as being controversial, but that's because there's been an effort to normalize this ethnic apartheid system over many years. And what we're saying is this ethnic apartheid system has actually incited violence, it's incited war, it's incited genocide in all corners of the country. We see, for example, on all borders of the Oromia region, there are, for example, identity-based violence, not just against the Amhara people, but, for example, on the border with Benishangul Gumuz, on the border with Gambela, on the border with Somali, on the border with the southern region. And so this is something that we've also seen in other parts. So in order to mitigate these inter-ethnic violence, inter-regional violence, the system needs to be reconsidered. However, if there is a lack of political will to reconsider the system, then in order to protect citizens, this is a policy that would do that. This policy would protect Amhara lives, because at present, these people face an existential threat. And then, as I said, it's not just the Amhara, it's other regional minorities, which are also under threat because of a certain expansionist and violent vision by extremists that are trying to impose their will onto others with no regard for the lives of thousands, if not of millions of Ethiopians. So Amhara provisional administration is a way to protect lives, and the alternative is to upend the ethnic federalism system, which in its inception excluded Amharas, one of the largest groups in the country, from the process, from the design process. So this is something that what we're proposing is something where we see a semblance of democracy. And thus far, for the last few decades in Ethiopia, we have not seen any semblance of democracy. We've seen the domination of a single ethnic group that's changed. Under TPLF, it was the domination of the Tigrayans. Under the Oromo Prosperity Party, it's the domination of the Oromos. And this domination of a single ethnic group is somehow proposed as a sign of equality. But this is not equality. This is the benefit of a single group at the expense of many others. And so it does not consider diversity and threatens the existence of regional minorities and other groups that they regard as rival groups. So this will not promote stability. This will not promote peace in Ethiopia. It's going to lead to more violence. So our proposal is not something that should be seen as controversial. It's something that should be seen as a way to resolve the ongoing violence and war that we're seeing in different parts of the country.
Thank you so much for your detailed issues and recommendations. Let me take you back to the issue of this negotiation. There is an issue of inclusivity on the negotiation. It is raised by different Amhara groups. What's your view on how to implement? Is there any update on these issues? You've been raising this thing very seriously, and also even you tried to bring up to the front line some delegators and this kinds of issues. What's going on now?
Yes, this is a good question. Amhara People's Negotiations Delegation was an initiative that was proposed to ensure that Amhara people were represented independently during the peace talks between the Prosperity Party and the TPLF to end the war in northern Ethiopia. The war in northern Ethiopia, starting from November 2020, was extremely devastating and impacted the lives of millions of people throughout Ethiopia, whether in Amhara, in Afar, or in the Tigray regions. So after 2 years of ongoing war, of mass atrocities, of pain and suffering, this peace process was a potential opportunity to end the suffering of these people and to transition to peace. However, we as AAA and I think the broader Amhara community, both in Ethiopia and in the diaspora, believed that the Prosperity Party could not negotiate on behalf of the Amhara people, including the Amhara branch, the Amhara Prosperity Party, we believed did not have the mandate, the acceptance, or any type of legitimacy to represent the Amhara people in any types of peace talks. And this was given by many different factors, but including the fact that these elements are complicit, or we believe are complicit in the genocide against the Amhara people, and also the mass arrest campaign that has continued this year against Amhara critics, journalists, and others. So this APND was formed with this vision to represent Amharas independently, and we were very vocal about pushing this APND delegation. Unfortunately, the peace process that was underwent in Pretoria, South Africa, and afterwards did not include the APND. And the APND released a statement stating that the exclusion of Amharas from peace talks would not bring lasting peace in Ethiopia. And this was for many reasons. Firstly, that there was no reason to expect that the TPLF would not wage another round of war, a fourth round of war against the Amhara people. And this was something that we've actually reported on afterwards in recent weeks. We issued an update in which our sources on the ground indicated that there was still mobilization by the TPLF militants to wage an invasion on the Raya and Alemt fronts. into the Amhara region. And so this is something that has been very concerning for us because over the 2 years of war, Amhara suffered in many different places across the Amhara region, also in the Afar region. And we believed that when you have a negotiation which involves the TPLF and the Prosperity Party, you cannot get a lasting peace deal, because these elements were fighting for the interests of their political power. And so when we talk about this APND, we still believe that there is an opportunity to make sure that the Amhara voice is heard, and the situation is still dynamic. So as I said, there's a possibility that this peace deal could easily be violated. We believe it's very frail, and that at any moment the TPLF could decide to re-wage war. So we're going to have to observe closely as to what happens. Otherwise, this APND is an entity that was put into place for a specific purpose, and that was to represent Amhara. So if the opportunity arises in the future, the APND can be utilized for this purpose to ensure that there's independent Amhara representation. And this is something that is very important because, as I mentioned before, in the current ethnic federalism system that is being used in Ethiopia, Amharas were not included in that process. And the exclusion of the Amharas in the process in the 1990s, we believe, led the way to the genocide and other human rights violations, the marginalization of Amhara people from Ethiopian politics, as the economic targeting and disenfranchisement. And we saw this transpire in all corners of the country, from Walqait and Raya to Matakal to Dera, where majority Amhara districts were annexed by other ethnic regional states, and the people there faced genocide. Earlier I mentioned the Dera report, but this was something that's been going on for a long time. And now we are also seeing these human rights violations intensifying in even in the country's capital. So this APND is a way for Amharas to ensure their interests are looked after, and there's potential to utilize it. And although we hope that this decision of facilities to believe that there could be more violence in the future, because as we know, the TPLF has a history of abusing ceasefires to wage more war, and at the same time, the ruling party has had a tendency to not want peace and to engage in this conflict for the interests of its own power.
As I can understand from your expression, recently there is no way that the Amhara groups are represented in the negotiation. But do you have any other plan, or do you have plan B if there is no inclusivity of the Amhara groups? If the government and TPLF or the Western is not allowed, are not going to allow you guys or Amhara peoples as a group concerned in the negotiation, is there any plan B that you're trying to do, or what are your movements in order to come up with this?
So this is a good question. And as I said, part of this is going to be determined by what transpires in the coming weeks and months. For example, we could see reignited fighting in the north. We're still seeing the ongoing violence in the south. And ultimately, there's going to have to be some type of national process to end the violence, but also to chart the path forward. And so we're seeing that Amhara people all throughout overwhelmingly supported the delegation, the APND. This was made clear by multiple joint statements by dozens of international Amhara organizations that supported the formation of the APND and what it represented, because this was an inclusive process that incorporated Amharas from all walks of life, from the civic organizations, from the military leadership, from other areas of society. So the idea that this would somehow disappear is not realistic, because this is a turning point in the history of the Amhara people, in the history of Ethiopia, where Amharas have demanded that their rights are respected and that their needs are looked after by the country, and any type of process that essentially violates that right would not be accepted and would be rejected by the Amhara people. So, for example, at this point, if the belligerents to the conflict were to decide to, for example, hand over Welkait and Raya, it's clear that the people there would resist, that these people would fight for their right, because they know the alternative is that there's going to be more genocide. They saw this under 3 decades of TPLF, and in some cases even more, because, for example, the issue of Welkait goes back to the 1980s. So these people have experienced those horrors. They've experienced decades of this repression, of the genocide, of the forced disappearance, of being treated as second-class citizens. And they've repeatedly said that this is not something they're going to accept again. So this is something that's happening on a people-wide level. And I believe the sooner the other belligerents can realize this, the sooner we can head to a point where there can be some semblance of peace.
Thank you so much. Roy, let me ask you one personal question. Someone like you was born in Canada and doesn't come to Addis or Ethiopia. How can be passionate in order to bringing up the awareness to the plights of Amharas, or what's happening to the Amhara peoples? You were born in Canada, and I know about you. So how can you become a person like you, not only you, people like you can be passionate on this?
Thank you. That's a good question, Maza. I think personally, I can say that coming to terms with my Amhara identity was a very important turning point in my life, because, as you know, for the vast majority of the Amhara population, they were raised to believe that they were Ethiopian first, and ethnic identity was never something that was the salient identity in how they viewed themselves. And when it comes to the issue in Ethiopia, this has been an issue that has been at the forefront for many years. So before my lifetime, and during the time of my parents, before that possibly. And what's really drawn me to the plight of the Amhara people is hearing the stories, in some cases experiencing it through family members, and essentially seeing the injustice and the little attention that it was given. Because I remember there were many instances where, we would hear about these stories of what happened in places like Arsi, what happened in places like Wolega or elsewhere in the country historically, whether it was in the 1990s, in the 2000s, or in the last decade. And when you hear these stories, it makes you drawn to the people affected, because it's a human rights issue. So you don't actually have to be Amhara to be an advocate for these people. And I think what we're seeing now in the age of social media is more youth, especially in the diaspora and on the ground in Ethiopia, being drawn to this issue, because this is an issue that affects them. So for someone like me, if I were to go back to visit Ethiopia, this is something that would affect me. This is something that would affect my family there. This is something that would affect my entire community. So I see it now as a personal duty to be an advocate for my people. And I think many other people also see it in this way. And this is something that's a renaissance. This is something that has taken the entire community by storm, because I think we're seeing now a heightened level of political consciousness, of awareness of one's identity, and of the issues that are taking place back home, because this is not some simple political issue. In the West, when there's political issues, it's drastically on a smaller scale. It's over policy, it's over stuff like healthcare, over taxing, over these types of things. In Ethiopia, it's a matter of existence. These people are facing an existential threat because there are violent armed groups, there are corrupt politicians, there are many different forces that want to see them completely wiped out from the face of Ethiopia. And Amhara people, they don't have any other home. Amhara people are endemic to Ethiopia. They're not found in any other country. So this is their homeland, and they should be allowed to live in their homeland in peace. And I think seeing this pattern of scapegoating, of vilifying the Amhara people, of portraying them as oppressors, even while they're being killed, is something that I think touch somebody on a very personal level and push them to be an advocate. So I see myself as that, and I see many other people my age and in my circumstances who have also been drawn to the cause and who've been drawn to be advocates for the Amhara people, because it's a universal human rights issue. You only need a conscience to be an advocate for Amhara people. So I think this is going to be something that develops further. There's going to be in the future more people who become vocal advocates, and there are people on the ground who are struggling on a daily basis, people like yourself, Ma'aza, who are very courageous, and we appreciate you, and we're also inspired by you. And for me personally, this is a personal duty that I see, and I'm going to continue to do it.
Thank you so much. I'm done with my questions, Robin, but if you have something to say and or to tell, you can take the stage.
Thank you, Ma'aza. I think I covered most of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me, and even the fact that we have a media like Roha Media, which is consistently talking about what's happening to these people in Ethiopia, is something I think which is a very big deal, and I'm very appreciative. And I hope everybody can support Roha. I also call on anybody who wants to stay up to date with AAA's activities to visit AAA's website at www.amharaamerica.org. You can follow AAA on Facebook, on Twitter, on Telegram, and you can use these human rights reports, for example, for advocacy, especially those of you living in Western countries who want to get involved. You can use these publicly available reports and send them to your policymakers, to your representatives, to journalists, to raise awareness of the Amhara plight, because this is why it's being done. Over many years, we've noticed that the plight of Amhara people was not something that was making it to the mainstream news and that was being covered by the human rights community. And that's why an organization like AAA and other organizations chose to begin doing reports on the plight of Amhara people and the human rights of Amhara people. So if we are not a voice for our people, then we can't expect anybody else to be. And so this is work that's being funded by our community. I'm a volunteer, my colleagues are volunteers, and that funding, for example, that we collect from the community goes towards our human rights investigators on the ground in Ethiopia. So if you believe in the work of AAA, if you want to help be a voice, you can also contribute financially to AAA's work. You can make donations. The link is found on AAA's website. And thank you, Ma'aza. I have nothing more to say.
Thank you so much for your time, and also as a AAA, thank you for being voice for the voiceless and for your exhaustive works on the reporters. It means a lot for the people who are suffering here. So thank you so much once again.